Hi everyone, welcome to this CIB ECR webinar entitled How to Design Resilient Residential Buildings. I'm Sina Muradi, CIB Program Manager and also the chair of this event. Today it is a great privilege to have two distinguished professors, Professor Bob Giddings and Professor Sophie Pelsmaker as the keynote speakers in this event. So without further ado, I will invite Professor Bob Giddings to start his presentation and keynote speech, and then we will proceed with Professor Sophie Pelsmaker's presentation. Bob, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, so my name is Bob Giddings. I'm chair of Architecture and Urban Design at Northumbria University, and I'm also joint coordinator of the CIB Architectural Design and Management Working Commission. And what I'd like to start with is really my interpretation of what resilience is. And I think it's another term really for sustainability, both of which are really ambiguous. It's about durability, and I think most importantly, it's about longevity. And that's something that I'd like to focus on. This house is in the UK. It is supposedly the house that has been lived in the longest and continuously in England. And it's been adapted multiple times. You're looking at various extensions from different periods of history. The house has been occupied for about 1,000 years. And when we consider the design of houses, we very often miss out two other really important ingredients. It's not about design of houses, it's about design of home. And human needs and place are just as important. So we think about human needs, we can show them as a kind of hierarchy that starts with the essential things at the bottom and moves up to more high-level attributes at the top. So we begin with the importance of shelter and safety and security and comfort. And then we start to move to important issues such as privacy and self-expression. And often where houses are provided for people, there's very little opportunity for the inhabitants to have self-expression. And then at the top is status. And that's really interesting status because it can be shown as something which is quite ostentatious, but on the other hand, it can be something which is really understated. And when it comes to place, first of all, there are disciplinary interpretations. And geography, philosophy, sociology, psychology, and ecology all have their own interpretations of what place is. But our concerns are mainly in architecture and urban planning. So what is it that's important about place? Well, first of all, it's about having a distinct character and maintaining that distinct character. It's about people feeling that they have an attachment, a belonging to a particular place, and that comes from its identity. It's really important for people's homes that there's a relationship between inside and outside, and equally that there is a feeling of neighborhood, of community, that they feel part of. And then there's this term, genus loci. which is slightly difficult to define, but it's about a protective spirit of the place. And it can be based on culture or religion. And then we come to the house, the part that we're most familiar with. But we need to analyze this carefully. And as in all architecture, it's about form and space and structure. The form being the three-dimensional appearance of the house, the space being how the spaces are used, and the structure, which should be expressed so that we can see clearly how this building or these buildings are constructed. So we break that down a little bit. First of all, it's about accommodating activities appropriately. It's about arranging the spaces so they're comfortable and interesting. It's about having the right materials to use. This notion of thresholds is often neglected. It needs to have a proper hierarchy between public and private. And then we come to the types, and there's lots of types, but a few of them are the villa, the cottage, the semi-detached, the terraced, and the apartment. And all of this can and should be based on, again, either culture or religion. In the UK, the terraced house form is used a lot, and it's a very good form because it helps to define external space, and yet it can also have variety and character within its form. And you can see here how this linkage of houses, each of them with their own particular characteristics. And there is also a good tradition in reusing existing buildings. This is a warehouse, which not surprisingly has access from water, but it's been converted into some very interesting apartments. And this really is an interesting place. Now, there's no way that all conversions are going to be in such interesting locations, but this is very distinctive in terms of its building and its locale. This little development in a village in the UK, first of all, looks like some traditional buildings. And that is the impression that was intended by the architects. But in reality, it's quite a modern development. And it's a development which is based on a series of inclined planes, which is much more of a modernist notion than it is a traditional notion. And it gives various messages. There's a lot of symbolism in this. And one of the symbols is that this inclined plane is just like a shelter would be in a rural environment. And if we had a perfect climate, it would just be this roof over a space, which is in fact the living space. So what the architects have done here, they said that we don't have a perfect climate, and therefore we do need enclosure. So they've created these glass planes either end, which just fit into the brickwork without any window frame at all. And they are very different from the other sorts of windows in the house, which have very sturdy frames. And the detailing, it harks back to, again, traditional notions of building, but actually there is nowhere in this area where the detailing is the same as this. So it's given an impression of a traditional way of building without actually being that traditional way at all. This notion of the fishing village, actually, there are similar patterns to this all around the world. Tightly packed, cohesive community, protection from the elements, and small defined external spaces. One of the things that we discover is mostly when spaces are designed, they're actually too big for comfort. And these little spaces actually suit people's needs much better. So overlaid upon this, we have another kind of hierarchy. Up to this point, we've really been considering the things at the top, the environmental qualities, things that are actually impressionistic and difficult to measure, things like atmosphere and ambience and character and image. And you can see there that they are defined as being, cultural aspects. This hierarchy we've used in a lot of research projects for all kinds of buildings, but they are really important in the house design. And what we mustn't forget are the ones that are at the beginning and the middle of the hierarchy, these performance attributes. Environmental quantities, fitness for purpose, building utilization, temperature, ventilation, illuminance, sound, energy utilization, and operational efficiency and buildability. So what we do is that we have to achieve those issues before we move on to the environmental qualities. And then to make the picture even more complicated, we're trying to cope with climate change. And this is usually seen as high temperatures and serious flooding. In this country, it's unlikely that we're going to suffer from very high temperatures, but other parts of the world certainly do. But what we've experienced in recent years is serious flooding. So what are the best ways of dealing with these kind of things? Well, one of them is to have green spaces. Green spaces actually help to reduce temperatures. They actually help to reduce wind speeds, and they offer permeability of the ground. One of the problems with flooding has been that there's been too many hard surfaces, so there's nowhere for the water to go. And recently, we've been involved with a funded research project on transformative urban heritage strategies for sustainable European historic housing stock. And what the funders are saying is that often we find much more flexible buildings, much more usable buildings, much more people-friendly buildings in the historic stock than we do in modern building. So one of the aspects that I'd like to bring out is that in recent times, there's been a lot of consideration about individual plots and the design of buildings on those plots. And what tends to happen is that we have large, deep plan buildings that just occupy the middle of a site and have no relationship with each other. And what Chris Alexander said is that we should actually be designing the space and then using the buildings to contain that space. And in that way, we'll get coherent urban patterns. So moving away from the UK to other parts of the world, Newcastle, Australia, they have a great tradition, again, of what they call row houses, which for us are terraced houses that have balconies, that have shaded windows, that are not very deep front to back, and therefore they have, natural ventilation. And this obviates the need for air conditioning, or at least reduces the load on it. And we see these kind of patterns, throughout the cities of Australia. And again, they're very attractive because they are, carefully designed with a lot of detail, and they feel like individual properties. What's happened of late is that they've become obsessed by this sort of commercial looking building, which is really supposed to be apartments. And as we all know, around tall buildings, we get very bad microclimates climatic conditions. We get increased wind speeds, we get heat islands, we get flooding because of the whole site being built. And it's become a total obsession in cities in Australia. And they seem to want to apply it to everything. And if you look at this student accommodation, you could actually lie this down on its side in the site that's available. And you could have a low rise that has exactly the same kind of accommodation that is in this point block. And not even seniors escape from this. And this is very isolating. It has no contact with external space or the ground. It is a situation where they are just in these kind of apartments, and I've seen them when they come out on the pavement below, and they're just bewildered as to where to go because there isn't anywhere that's comfortable for them. So a village it isn't. But it gets worse. We in this country have had a lot of high-rise development in the 60s and 70s. Fortunately, most of it has now been demolished because of its technical and social failures. What's happened to others is that they've been reclad and dangerous practices have occurred. This is the notorious Grenfell Tower. You see it caught fire. The cladding allowed the fire to spread, and a number of people died. So we move on to Brazil, and we see this kind of Portuguese influence as being a very attractive feature of their towns and cities, but they don't necessarily see it that way. In João Pessoa, there's this really beautiful historic center, but as you can see, I hope you can see on this slide, it's closed up. It's fenced. The windows are all shuttered, and that's because it's empty. And a high proportion of this historic core is now uninhabited. And you might ask why that's occurred. And I think it's because they still see it as part of an expression of imperialism. They're trying to actually break away from the Portuguese conquerors, even, hundreds of years later. So where are they going? Well, those that can afford it are going to the ocean. And these towers are very often gated communities. Communities being another misnomer, because again, they're very isolating places. There's very poor external space because they're all individual commercial developments. Notice the way that they are intimidating the little houses which are next to them before the green space. They're heat islands that require a lot of air conditioning. So people in these Brazilian cities are faced with a real dilemma. They're kind of being forced into this sort of development because that's what's available. And they're losing the historic core because they don't find an identity with it. And where all this is heading is no place. And if you think about some of the things I said at the beginning about human needs, about identity and expression and status and so on, this is just accommodation which is provided that you can't tell where anybody lives. A lot of this comes together in Saudi Arabia. This is a traditional street in Riyadh. And these are very private people. So you have very little expression on the outside of what these houses are. They don't even identify where one house starts and the next one finishes. There are very few openings. In fact, the only openings there are in the male visitors accommodation, which is on the upper level, as you can see here. But inside, it's a totally different story. These are courtyard houses, and there is a lot of patterning and decoration and interest and foliage and water and so on. Once you get inside, it all opens out into these rather lovely spaces. And it's always been a great design because as well as, you know, helping people with their privacy and their focus on family, what it's done is that in this society, because of the religion, there are strict rules about who can meet who, and especially male visitors can't meet female residents. So this becomes a great sort of communication kind of space, as well as acting as the core of the house. So it's been very successful in you know, for actually centuries. But what happened was, as you know, Saudi Arabia discovered oil, and it rather changed their attitude because they needed people with experience in oil to exploit it. So they went to the Americans and they set up a partnership with the Americans. And when the American oil people came to Saudi Arabia, they said they weren't going to live in these kind of houses. And what they wanted was American style villas, which the designs were taken from America and transplanted into Saudi Arabia. So some of the spaces that the Saudis already had, like these roof terraces, you know, were just not seen as being appropriate for the Americans. And the Saudis soon got a grip of this, and they saw it, you know, as the future. And they didn't want to live in these courtyard houses anymore, which they saw as being of the past. And because the Americans had rejected them, they thought they should be rejecting them as well. So they got involved in this villa kind of approach. But it didn't suit them at all. And as you can see here, you know, the outward looking windows really affected the Saudis. So they started putting up these great fences and blocking them in. And even, you know, blocking up windows in some of these villas. And this has created enormous problems because a lot of people barely go out. They don't get any natural light into their houses. There's serious mental issues with them feeling trapped inside these buildings. And then to add to that, you know, there's all the energy problems because they use massive amounts of air conditioning for these houses. And the temperature in Saudi Arabia is going up anyway. But because there's so much energy being put into the external environment from the air conditioning, the temperatures are rising in addition to that. So they're actually having to put in bigger and bigger air conditioning units all the time to compensate for it, which again creates more and more energy. And it's turning into a real problem. So people like Majid and others have been trying to think how they can adapt the courtyard and also take into account people's 21st century aspirations. And they've started to come up with designs like this, which have private courtyards so that there can be substantial openings into the courtyards, but fewer openings onto the street. They have this legislation about setbacks, which I think is rather unfortunate, but it's aimed at trying to make all the properties individual, which is such a change from their history, where, as I said before, you couldn't tell where one started and one finished. They don't want them linking up anymore. But it does mean that you can use the space and the setbacks for moving between the courtyards. So, you know, it's starting to be a useful compromise, this, because it enables people to interact with the outside space and not become prisoners, and also to use you know, natural ventilation more. Okay, I just want to finish with this competition that we ran last year in South Africa. It was a competition predominantly for architectural students, and we had 68 entries to it. So this was one of the entries, and I just want to point out some of the features of it, because this is a really flexible design. It's based on a frame, and you can add in and take out accommodation as you need it within the frame. Two of the major concerns that they have in South African cities, and Pretoria in particular, is the problem of informal settlements and informal trading. So the idea here was to create a community. So the proposals, as well as the flexibility for the buildings, have social space, they have marketplaces, and there's facility for people to be able to generate produce, which they can sell in the markets or eat themselves. And there's all sorts of little workshops and so on involved in the design to try and get over the problem of informal trading. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob, for this very insightful presentation. I really appreciate it. So now let's proceed with Sophie's presentation, and then we will take some questions at the end. Sophie, you may now share your screen.
Okay, and can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Right. So yeah, thank you so much, Bob, for that talk. And I'll sort of continue on that, perhaps more at a sort of strategic level as well, trying to bring that together. So yes, I really wanted to talk about why sustainable housing design matters. And I'll briefly talk about the issues that we face and where can we go from here. And it links back to the, you know, sort of concepts that also Bob talked about. And I'll cover sort of some of the solutions, which are diverse and adaptable infrastructures, then social infrastructure, green infrastructure, and then inclusive and equitable infrastructures and co-production of them, and then summarize briefly. So in urban development, and Bob already covered some of that as well, we face issues like climate change, where, for example, very ill prepared around the world for a changing climate. We've got very little consideration of adaptation in our current existing built environment, let alone anything that we build new as well. We've got huge issues with biodiversity loss. A lot of that is caused by encroachment on land from urban development, also agriculture fields as well, and of course, cut down of forests around the world, but particularly urban development also still affects that. We're facing aging population, which is good news, but it's actually a problem if we're not prepared for it. And also, as Bob was showing this example of like this thinking of where will older people live, what kind of, you know, spaces do we provide for them? So it's a good thing that we're going to live longer. That's a happy thing, but not when we haven't thought about how we could accommodate older people in our urban environment. We often lead very unsustainable lifestyles, so we move around with active modes of transport rather than more sustainable modes of transport like walking or cycling. And, you know, that then also creates other issues with health as well. We have a huge amount of waste from construction, demolition. We just don't take a circular approach to things at all. And I think Bob very nicely also covered these issues of heritage and reuse of entire buildings and the adaptation of them. That is so important. And then overall, really, while we are perhaps living longer, we overall have a declining health and well-being, also mental health issues that is affected by the built environment, of course, also other impacts as well. But while we might live longer, we might not necessarily live longer healthier. And a lot of this is also leading to increased inequalities and disempowerment of people and communities. So there's exclusion and justice issues that are really important to consider as well. So here in Finland, I didn't properly introduce myself, but so I'm based in Finland. I worked in the UK for over 20 years. In the last 5 years, I've been in 6 years, I've been in the Nordic region, and particularly last 5 in Finland. Some of the things that we face, you can see here on this image, this is a development in Vuoris, right outside actually where I live. This is typically what it looks like in Finland, rather flat, loads of lakes hidden there, and then sort of pine and birch forest. And what happens is that, as I just mentioned, we've got this biodiversity loss because basically, and even in Finland, this happens when we need to accommodate 3,000 additional people every year. We just cut down the forest and we expand the cities further out into the forest. And this is actually what it looks like. And when you go and visit, it's like a moon landscape. And then we do, of course, build these amazing houses that are all in wood. These are apartments here, and they're low energy, often near passive house standards. So they're like considered sustainable kind of housing, but they have a huge impact on the environment. The other thing also that happens is there's a lot of granite rock, and they explode the rock, millions of year old rock, to then create a flat level because it's easier to construct on that and make gardens and so on. So what I really want to bring out in my talk is that, and I think Bob already did that very well, is that we often think that housing design is this technical and technological considerations and issues to solve. So it's about saving carbon dioxide emissions, climate change mitigation, and then not consider all the other issues as well that go along with resilient kind of built environment. And so also it is about, particularly then this area as well, about services we provide, transport connections, and also how we then have this impact on human well-being and on nature. As I said with this image, we keep on cutting down the forest and fragmenting urban nature as if actually that's not an important consideration that we should do as well. And I think around the world, especially in Finland, and I think also in the UK, housing is often considered as providing efficient units. It sort of strikes me, this image that Bob was showing with all of these units, that there is no differentiation between them. Everybody is basically a space to seek shelter, but not really to have self-expression or feel safe and so on. And now it's sort of like very much about this efficient provision of shelter and efficient units in an efficient block. So as many units as possible to maximize rental or for sale profit. And this is really problematic because it leads to these other health impacts that then have societal implications of increased healthcare is needed. People might not be as healthy to go and work, they might be more sick and so on. So it has huge implications as well. Throughout my talk, I will have these boxes that pop up where I'm linking to the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and their cities report. So if you look at the whole report of the IPCC, it's something like 3,000 pages, but it's a really fantastic 60 pages that you have on adaptation for cities and urban areas. And I will take out snippets of that where it also links what I'm talking about in my talk and from research as well. Everything I'm talking about is from research project findings. And so the IPCC is also really vocal about how we have to protect ecosystems and biodiversity and how we have to increase green infrastructures instead of actually removing green infrastructures like access to the forest and so on. And so the other notion that I want to bring out, and this is particularly a big issue also in Finland, is, as I said, we tend to consider the housing units on a plot as a unit, like the apartment. I'm talking now about housing as apartments, multi-family dwelling buildings. And often living is considered to happen in just that apartment. But as Bob was also showing, it takes place in the housing block and in the neighborhood. And this is why I've stopped kind of referring a lot to housing, because for me, housing is happening at these 3 scales, but actually I refer to it as a living environment and that it interconnects at these different scales. And so you can see here, this is a typical kind of urban environment. You've got the micro scale, the 1 unit, But living doesn't just happen there. It's connected to what happens in the housing block. Like the last example from the student competition shows you that in one block, you can have diverse other uses that bring the community together, that actually create a community rather than living in that one unit. And then, of course, also there's the surroundings, immediate neighborhood as well. And of course, in the wider city as well. So we have these micro, meso, and macro scales that I'll come back to as well. And it's really important we consider housing at all of these levels, because if we have certain conditions in place at a macro scale, it will and it should affect how we design the block, the mesoscale, and the unit itself as well. And that then has very much to do with the location in the city, if it's suburban or very urban area, and so on. And we often don't do that as designers and engineers and as clients and developers. And of course, then we also have overlaying on top of the micro scale, we also have the individual and the household characteristics as well that really matter. What the earnings are of a family, how affordable things are, how they're healthy or not, and so on, what their needs are for them, these different scales as well. And then at the mesoscale, we're then talking, for example, at democratic community processes, co-production. So it's not just a housing block, but it's actually the co-creation of it. And then at macro scale, also policies are very important. I come back to that. So we continue to have this global impact because of our impact at these different scales as well, and not considering enough the environmental implications. And we continue to exploit people, nature, and non-humans, and it then negatively impacts communities and creates what we call embodied injustices as well. And particularly countries and communities that contributed the least to global climate crisis and the planet's environmental degradation are now actually really suffering the severe consequences, like flooding, territorial loss. We talked already about extreme temperatures as well. It's got associated loss of people's lives and their livelihoods as well. And one of the things that the IPCC really drew out was that the built environment is really behind adaptation measures, but why it's also so important that we are not only catching up, but are ahead of the game, is because once we make an intervention in the built environment, it lasts an incredibly long time. So it what we call locks in negative impacts for a very long time. So it means that once we do something now, it's actually going to have that negative impact, whether it's a social impact or an environmental impact or CO2 impact, for the next 50 or 60 years. And that's why it's so important that we get things right now and in the past, because of that long lock-in time. And of course, because we're all actors in the built environment, we have this significant local, but also global responsibility to get things right. And that's really urgent and rather crucial as well. So there are several things that we're doing about this. EU policies, IPCC are obviously highlighting this, and I'm sure you all know this, but there's a lot of focus in the EU around low carbon buildings and infrastructure, also climate resilient. It's about increasing biodiversity, green space, and green infrastructure. It's about reducing reliance on these active modes of transport, like motorized transport. Instead, we should encourage walking, cycling, and public transit. Or rather, active transport isn't right, but the non-public and non-sustainable transportation. We need to invest in a clean energy supply, and we need to ensure health and well-being of citizens that we protect. And then, of course, we need to have new skills that people can deliver this net zero carbon and circular economy as well. And this is also really stressed in the EU, we can't leave people behind. So it has to happen with social equity so that no one's left behind. It's a just transition. When Bob was showing you the picture of Grenfell and the fire, this wasn't just people that lost their lives. These were often actually people that were vulnerable in other ways as well. And that were then actually left there to literally die. And these upgrades were kind of done to reduce the energy use in the building, but then actually cheaply done to save money and not properly done. And then it has all of these other implications, and it creates huge societal injustices. So that's sort of setting the scene of the scale I'm talking about, both at the scale of the living environment, but also globally, what the issues are we face. So where do we go from here? How do we respond to these challenges, and how do we enact these policies that we have in actual reality? Now, some key themes that have been occurring in our research and in other people's research and they're very interconnected for the design and transformation, are then these four kind of infrastructure. So it's about diversity and adaptable infrastructure, social infrastructure, green infrastructure, and inclusive and equitable infrastructures, which is connected to co-production as well. Now, what we notice is that they're rarely included, any one of them, let alone together. But But actually, when these are combined, what we found in our research is that we create then resilient urban environments. So by resilience is by being able to bounce back when an adverse event. So for example, when there was a pandemic, when there was people who had access to adaptable infrastructures could work from home because they could make changes in their home to enable that. When there was social infrastructures, they could still get together with the community in a safe way. When there was green infrastructures, they could still use the green spaces nearby their home and had an outlook of green that supported their well-being. And then, of course, when it was inclusive and equitable, again, it sort of was they were part of a community. They weren't completely left to their own devices. So when we have these together, they create a resilient built environment. And that's the same when there's demographic changes, climate change, and biodiversity decline. So all of these things actually support that when we have these infrastructures together. And of course, this comes back to genus loci and the situated context as well. And some examples that Bob was showing, it's about then also the place and the social and environmental context that we need and cultural context we need to take into account, and where we need different solutions at the micro, meso, macro scales instead of this sort of universal design between Sao Paulo, these tower blocks that we then find again in London, that we find again in Finland, when actually there's very different issues that we face and very different climatic and cultural issues as well. You can see references on the right-hand side. Happy for these slides to be shared, so you can also go back to these sources as well. But I'll run through now very swiftly all of these four infrastructures and give you some examples of that. So the first one that we say is really important are these diverse and adaptable infrastructures. So what it really is the housing and other infrastructures are versatile. So we mean that there's sufficient differentiation, and not each unit is the same, but there's actually differentiation within them, that they can meet the needs of different kinds of people that have different family structures, for example, and different cultures and ways of using space as well. And then on top of that, we need to make sure that those spaces can be adapted so that they can evolve when there is different and changing needs over the residents' life course, including, of course, climate change. And that can be temporary changes like with the pandemic, or they can be longer lasting changes that people might want to make as their family situation changes. That means that we shouldn't have more than 30% of the same kind of space provision. So we shouldn't have more than 30% of small units or only family units. We need diversity of people. So that's where we need to mix that. And that we attract different kinds of people. So we need spaces with different kinds of layouts to suit and different spatial and social preferences and needs. Now, why that's important, of course, when we can make easily temporary and longer lasting changes in the home, and also externally and in the shared community space, it means that residents are supported to not move every time their situation changes. So we actually, because if they cannot make changes, we create transient communities and they don't input in the community, don't make an effort, they move along. And so it really reduces transient communities and supports stability, diversity, and community building, which then again supports diversity of people. Older people are being looked after. It actually really supports mental well-being as well. And of course, it also ensures longevity because it reduces the risk of premature obsolescence. So it's linked to the circular economy. And if there's premature obsolescence, buildings are often then declared obsolete. They will then be demolished if their units don't meet societal needs in the future as well. And again, this links back to the IPCC in particular. They talk about climate change mitigation is very much linked at the design stage, including what they call multifunctionality. So again, this adaptability of space and multifunctions that can happen so that they can allow adjustment in size to evolve user needs and transforming existing buildings to reduce land use and CO2. And they then talk again about the lock-in of unadaptable stranded assets. And that is all part of mitigating climate change. And also, of course, every fraction of a degree that we reduce matters as well. So also the IPCC has picked up on this, particularly related to urban development and the built environment. So some examples here that you can see, even in a small studio apartment, which are on the whole problematic. We shouldn't have too many of these because they don't suit many people at different life stages. But even in a small studio apartment, if designed well, they've got windows on two sides, you can actually still provide some differentiation and some adaptability of where people sleep, or if they have a combined living dining and if everything is kind of one bigger open space, or if they have a separated niche as well. It's about furnishability, to be able to put furniture more in one place and so on. And actually this is stipulated in the Finnish building regulations, but it's actually never really provided. Instead, what happens in Finland, instead of these kind of units, we end up with 80% of our studio apartments being built like these long tunnels with a window at one end. And it means that you cannot actually really separate any of the living spaces from the bedroom. there is not even any adaptability or different furnishability possible in these spaces, and they're hugely problematic. And this will create obsolescence, and there's less need for these as well. Then the other issue is also when we looked at a sample of 4,000 units in Finland, only 0.25% 8 units were deliberately designed to be adaptable. So you can see here a large unit, 3 bedrooms already, whereby one smaller studio could be attached through connection. Of course, it's problematic if a large unit becomes even larger, or at least it can be split off as well. But when we checked all of these other units, like here, you could actually start to combine a lot of them together with good design as well. But this wasn't allowed for. So to create, at least in the future, some block at the mesoscale adaptability, so that we don't have to demolish a whole block when these studio apartments no longer are getting enough occupation in them. There are some preconditions to create adaptable infrastructures. We need sufficient social private space. We need units that are shallow plan, not deep plan, so that means less than 6 meters deep. So as you can see here, rather than that long tunnel example I was showing you. And we need carefully considered layouts and window placement, so we can really optimize furnishability, circulation airs, and ability to divide rooms as well. And you can see here that multiple windows support adaptability, so we don't create spaces where you have no window or ventilation as well. Actually, quickly on this, you can even see here that by just moving the balcony and the balcony door, you actually need less space for circulation, but it also allows you in the future, so instead of having these 2 large windows, we create the same window areas, but you actually split them up, and then you can actually create another room here if you wanted to in the future as well. And you reduce the amount of circulation needed. So it's better furnishability for this space in any case, even if it wasn't divided up. So there's very at the micro scale, small things that architects can do a lot better when we consider it. And then one of the things, of course, is that the mesoscale affects the micro scale and vice versa. So in Finland, what's happening is at a planning level, we end up with this dotted line, which is showing you the buildable area that the developer can build. And it literally will stretch out the building to that maximum level. So we get these fat blocks, these long, deep units, instead of actually, if the buildable area was more like this, we end up getting the same number of units, many more south facing here. We get a much nicer kind of courtyard as well, potential, but we're not stuck anymore with these double loaded corridors and very narrow units facing one way and only windows on one way. So it's really important that we need to get that macro scale right, so the urban scale right first. So we need to really challenge the city plan as well to create then these adaptable infrastructures at the micro scale, because that knocks all the way through to the mesoscale as well. And that brings me also then to social infrastructure. So social infrastructure are opportunities for people to interact with each other through everyday indoor or outdoor shared spaces and functions in the living environment. And that's really important because it supports individual well-being and community cohesion as well. And again, that doesn't have to be in the building block at the mesoscale, but it could be at then the macro scale, so in the living, in the immediate kind of neighborhood as well. So it's really about social interactions that are supported in neighborhoods that are then, for example, can be mixed-use neighborhoods, diverse public open space, built form, local services on the human scale. And they can also be very small things. So it's about being pedestrian-oriented. So it's, again, equitable access, regardless of whether you can drive somewhere or not, or how your mobility issues are. And it's about access to high quality green space, biodiverse environments, views of nature, and nice to be in at different seasons as well. And it can be a bench or a porch at the entrance of a building or a shared community room that's pleasant to be on. And it's designing spaces that basically allow people to sit and sleep on, using the undercraft of other spaces, leftover spaces we can kind of use, instead of sort of some of this more aggressive, hostile kind of architecture where we design benches so no homeless people can sleep in them and so on. And again, this is really emphasized by the IPCC. They recognize that we need to increase inclusive and accessible social infrastructure. We need to promote interaction between community members to support resilience. Because when there's an adverse event, people will look after each other. When they have meeting places, they will notice when an older person is not showing up to the regular meeting or their regular coffee or their little walk around in the courtyard, and people can go and check in on them. So it actually isn't as being shown to save lives as well. That's how important some of the things are that we do. And so it's about these accessible, diverse and inclusive spaces for diversity of people, co-living and so on. And some examples here in France and in Norway are part of that as well. And it really supports well-being, reduces isolation and so on. And that also really links with green infrastructure, of course. because green infrastructure also is being shown to be massively supporting social connections, as well as the reason why people go to spaces. So green infrastructure encapsulates all of the diverse green spaces that support flora and fauna, but it's at these different scales. It can be woodlands, fields, hedgerows, trees that act as habitats for non-humans, but also then support human connection to nature and this social inclusivity as well, which then supports community resilience and also individual resilience and well-being. And then, as I said, it's also seen to really bring people together. But what's really important is that it's not just visual access from the housing to greenery. So having view of a tree or a greenery is very important for mental well-being, but also very easy physical access to it as well. So it's not good enough that we end up with a large open space, but it's actually a kilometer away for most people, because it's not that accessible to people. And you can see Bob's examples were showing a lot of cases where there was no greenery accessible at all. So it's about physical and visual accessibility. It's got to be appealing for citizens that will then protect and appreciate and use these spaces. And ideally, these spaces are also co-developed with the policymakers, the community, and the users and others as well. So, of course, it matters massively because it supports biodiversity, but it's also one of the key measures that is so crucial for climate change mitigation and adaptation, because it creates this microclimate. Evaporative cooling reduces the local heat island temperatures during heat waves. It absorbs pollution as well if it's well designed. But then, of course, also it reduces the flood risk, or it slows down also some of the flood events as well. So, and then on top of that, we also have this sort of biodiversity aspect, why it's so important. And then, of course, the presence and access to green spaces is also so important for mental well-being, for us to be able to cope with adversity of different kinds and scale. And it then also supports physical and social activity as well. And again, the IPCC really brings this out, that we need to prioritize this as well. An example here is in Copenhagen, where you had this square, if you like, of 1,000 square meters was asphalted. And then they actually completely refurbished this to become rain gardens and open that up and create more of this kind of social space and social infrastructure as well. So this is like the transformation of an environment. Some other examples are the ones that you're probably familiar with, the super blocks in Barcelona, whereby they push a lot of the traffic and motorized transport and pollution and noise to the outside of 9 blocks, so only there it can happen. And then all of these streets are handed over back to the community as well, with like planters and so on, and then play areas for children. A lot of this is happening green infrastructure in China. This is an example of the Rendscape, their sponge city approach. So what happens typically, it used to be that, so the river is really sort of, it's a defensible space. It's really kind of caught in, and channeled across. But then when there's suddenly a massive rain event outside in the mountains, then it suddenly floods into the cities. And at one point, the barrier breaks and there's a major flood event. So what they're doing is in China, they're removing concrete defensible barriers, they're creating accessible waterways for water, other species and humans. And this is then what it starts looking like as well, which is really rather amazing. There's then also issues like cleaning of water. And so it's really giving, it's like this lung in the city is really giving, it's like it becomes a floodplain in the city, giving space back to water so you can actually take it over. But when actually the river takes up less space, it becomes this huge green infrastructure and lung for the city and its residents as well. Another example is in the Vauban, where there's a lot of greenery in the back gardens, and people have much improved mental health when they have these views of nature. And of course, some of this also comes back to versatility, diversity, and the social infrastructure, where it's not just purely residential areas, but also mixed use as well, where there's shops and schools and so on dotted around. And then you can see that it really then also supports this sort of the cycling and the tram use and so on, and the green connections as well. And then in Sheffield, this was a European funded project. It's Grey to Green, is one of the largest like transformations where they really try to go from sort of the grey asphalted area to green phasing and connect different parts of the city. So here you can see what it was like and what it has become on the right-hand side. But then what happens in Finland is we do new developments, we knock trees down, and then we build this back. And then in Finland, it takes so long to grow trees again because it's cold. So it takes 30, 40 years for any maturity. And this is really a severe issue in Finland, actually. Again, here you can see that we had these amazing entrance into the largest suburb of Finland, and they cut them all down just so that how new housing could be built and the road could be moved by 5 meters. So a line on the architect's drawing or engineer's drawing actually really matters in reality. And the same, we built a sustainable tramway, and they cut all of the mature trees down in the city centre. They've replanted them with small ones now, but they will never grow that big again. So we really need to work to different values and protect the green that we have instead of cut it down as well. And that then brings me to the last infrastructure that is so important, which is about inclusive and equitable infrastructure and co-production. So it really means that inhabitants should be part of democratic processes in the built environment, creating a feeling of ownership, and to ensure that their needs are understood and then included in the urban development process, without then people making top-down decisions and then putting well-being of the community and individuals at risk as well. And it's really about solutions and processes that are inclusive of all inhabitants. So we need to include people's voices we don't often hear, which is young people, kids, older people, immigrants, homeless people, and so on. So vulnerable communities as well. And of course, also trying to work with the needs of the non-humans. So we need to then work with radical inclusivity principles. They don't always have a voice. We can't talk to them, but it's about then actually working with ecologists and biologists as well. And of course, why does this matter? We know, and the IPCC again has stressed this, we know that a solution, even if technically it should work, it cannot be resilient on its own. It's only resilient when it's adopted, taken ownership of by the community, and that's best done through inclusive bottom-up or inside-out approaches as well. So it's particularly adaptation plans as well. They need to be co-created, as the IPCC says, with local citizens, communities, stakeholders, policymakers, and we really must prioritize vulnerable communities and individuals. It comes back to this just transition. And when the most vulnerable in our communities benefit, we all actually benefit as well. An example of this is where we have a community garden, and it can be resilient when we have good implementation and maintenance of the solutions at the micro scale. We need active community that's willing to use and engage with the solutions. So it's not out of context. Mesoscale, it meets their needs. And then at the meso-macro scale, we need to have people have skills and knowledge to know how to use it, maintain it. So it's facilitation also needed with the processes. And that requires good policies at the city scale that allow that to work, as well as then promoting similar cases and solutions and upscale. This is some macro scale, so you can see how these things are linked as well. So summing up now, we need to really design and transform for well-being of people and planet. And that means we need living environments that are adaptable, diverse, inclusive, co-produced with inhabitants, and that prioritize green and social infrastructure. And when we design lightly on the planet, and when we respect nature and non-humans, there are these huge co-benefits for us as humans, but it's flipping things around rather than designing for us first. Because of course, we cannot be healthy and do well on an unhealthy planet or when the planet is in crisis. And the IPCC is really emphasizing these co-benefits of an inclusive and just climate risk reduction, and focuses on planetary health that then improves human health and well-being as well. And we cannot do this alone, because what is needed are these rapid and far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. We can no longer make small changes, but we need transformational change. And that's why we need to work together for this more resilient and sustainable world.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for this wonderful presentation. We have already exceeded the allocated time for this webinar, but if there is any question from our participants, so please feel free to ask. We have roughly 2 minutes for questions. Okay, so it seems that everything was clear, and there is no question. I thank our speakers again for their thought-provoking presentations and speeches, and I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.